Welcome back, scholars, to our APUSH review for Unit 11, which will be on imperialism and on World War I. I'm looking in your red book, which is on page 93, and there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions, which are all very similar in basically asking motivations for the Spanish-American War, often asking you to compare it with the War of 1812 or the Mexican War. First of all, starting here, from 1793 to 1812, the U.S. was pushed around a bit in its early years. Jay's Treaty in 1795 dealt with the fact that the British were still occupying western forts and land owned by the U.S., and Britain was also blocking U.S. trade with the West Indies. 2, Pinckney's Treaty, also called the Treaty of San Lorenzo, dealt with the problem of Spain occupying Natchez and blocking U.S. shipping Western goods via New Orleans. Point 3 here, on 1795, the Native Americans signed away large parts of modern Ohio in the Treaty of Greenville. This might not be considered Indians pushing around Americans, but frontier violence was a problem. 4, under President John Adams, there was an undeclared naval war with French ships. Sometimes it's called the quasi-naval war with France. These French ships were seizing U.S. ships, trading with England. Remember, the United States is caught in this fray between revolutionary France beginning in 1789 all the way through really the end of Napoleon in 1815. And under Adams, there was an attempt to extort money from us in that XYZ affair. Point 5, 1801 through 1805, the Barbary pirates were seizing U.S. ships and cargoes and crews and holding them for ransom. And then point 6 here, British impressment and arming of Indians led to Madison declaring war, which led to the War of 1812. So these are all arguments for, we are the victim, we're the little guy, we're getting pushed around. Now, if you're looking at the Mexican War, also called the Mexican-American War, if you're saying that it's not an act of aggression, well, you could argue that we're going to war against Santa Anna, who is a dictator. He has overthrown a revolutionary government that conceived a democratic Mexican state, but we were going to war against a dictator. Also, Mexico was interfering with Texan slavery, and Mexico demanded allegiance to the Catholic Church. Mexico interfered with Texan settlement and trade, eventually banned further immigration, and required tariffs to be paid on imports from the U.S. Many Mexican troops garrisoned in Texas were abusive, and rebellious Texans were arrested and jailed without trial. And of course, there's that ultimate argument that the first shots were fired on American land, about the dispute at this point between where the Mexican-Texan border was. We said it was farther to the south at the Rio Grande. The Mexicans said it was farther to the north at the Rio Nueces. But at the time, many Americans believed that shots had been fired on our side of the border. If you say, yes, this is an act of aggression, well, James K. Polk ran on an 1844 platform of manifest destiny, which is very openly saying that there will be territorial expansion. Previously, he had threatened war with Britain/Canada over the Oregon border. Polk moved troops into disputed land along the Texan border, claiming land all the way to the Rio Grande. This led to a Mexican attack on an American patrol. The U.S. did not merely secure the disputed border, but invaded northern Mexico and invaded Veracruz on the coast and marched inland and seized Mexico City. The U.S. seized and kept New Mexico and California. So this war, it's not just over the border. Arguably, it's basically a war in pursuit of manifest destiny. To expand our territory has to come at the expense of somebody else. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo will pay Mexico for its cession, the Mexican cession of the southwestern part of what becomes the United States, what would have been northern Mexico. Uniqueness of earlier expansion. Pre-Civil War expansion was to fill the North American continent. In 1803, we purchased Louisiana from Napoleon. Various wars against the Indians were for the purpose of opening up Western settlement for American pioneers and settlers. 1808, the Convention of 1818 settled the border of Canada with the U.S. 1819, we purchased Florida from Spain, and we agreed on a favorable western border with California in the Transcontinental Treaty also called the Treaty of Adams-Onis, and this is 1819. You have the war with Mexico and the occupation of the far west. You have the purchase of the Mesilla Valley in Arizona for railway building purposes and the Gadsden Purchase. And you have the peaceful division of Oregon with Britain. This is right before the Mexican War. So all of these events are filling out the continent. Later expansion, how was it unique? Later post-Civil War expansion is overseas. Well, Alaska is not exactly overseas, but it's certainly far from the continental U.S. We purchased Alaska in 1867 from Russia. In 1898, Hawaii is annexed after the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. In 1899, the Samoa archipelago is divided between the U.S. and Germany. The U.S. in 1898, angry over Spanish mistreatment of Cubans, goes to war against Spain. Why do we intervene? Well, the abuse of the Cuban people, which is publicized in the yellow press. The Spanish were putting Cubans in concentration camps where they were dying of exposure and disease and of malnutrition. There's an insulting telegram to Spain intercepted and published. This telegram was from Dupuy de Lomé, in which he insults the President of the United States, in which he basically acknowledges that Spain has no intention of dealing honestly with the Americans, who are considering ourselves to be the defenders of our little brown brothers, the Cubans. That's quote unquote little brown brothers, of course. Destruction of the U.S. sugar cane plantations in the ongoing Civil War, the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, and the fact that the U.S. had had its eye on Cuba ever since the Ostend Manifesto before the Civil War. So there's sort of a lot of things going on here. If you're arguing that this is an aggression against Spain, it could be pointed out that the U.S. does not just liberate Cuba, but that we also, before we invade Cuba and to liberate it, we take the Philippines, which is on the other side of planet Earth. We take Puerto Rico and Guam, so there's a lot of things we're taking from the Spanish. We're not just defending Cubans. Although, to be fair, it's not on the sheet here. The Teller Amendment does say that we will not take Cuba as a colony, and we do give Cuba their independence. Although, on the other hand, it can be argued that the Platt Amendment is an agreement in the Cuban Constitution that allows the Americans to intervene to sort of protect the Cubans from any problems they may bring on themselves, whether within or from without. Other places the U.S. intervenes after the Civil War. We intervene in Venezuela's Guianan border dispute with England in 1899. The U.S. buys the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917 for $25 million. William Howard Taft advocates dollar diplomacy, which sought hegemony and stability in Latin America through American investment. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is remember, the Monroe Doctrine is we're telling the Europeans to stay out of Latin America, to stay out of our backyard, where Teddy Roosevelt, though, declares the right to intervene in the affairs of Latin America to keep order and to prevent European intervention. This first takes place in the island of the Dominican Republic, where U.S. troops seize the customs houses to collect money in order to pay debt owed to Europeans. So we're kind of we're the debt collectors here. Later, U.S. troops intervene in Haiti and Nicaragua and in Mexico. General Pershing is sent by President Wilson to chase Pancho Villa after he attacks Americans in both Mexico, and he crosses the border and he shoots up a U.S. town in New Mexico. Question 3. You'll notice there are 3 different questions here that are kind of sort of the same, answering the same question here about American involvement in World War I. Wilson's diplomacy has been called missionary diplomacy, highly moralistic, self-righteous, condescending, messianic, and idealistic. He intervened in the Mexican Revolution. President Madero was murdered by the dictator Huerta. Wilson sent the U.S. military to occupy Veracruz in order to stop a shipment of German weapons. Wilson entered World War I in order to make the world safe for democracy and engaged reluctantly in World War I as a war to end all wars. Wilson's 14 points were his plan for a future European peace based on the idea of a peace without revenge, without victors. His naive plan ran aground on British and French hatred of Germany. The Versailles Treaty punished Germany. Clause 231 said Germany was the cause of the Great War, and the Germans had to sort of sign on the dotted line that they were the culprits. Germany had to pay reparations, which we did not take, by the way, but we're part of this treaty that made them pay the reparations. The Rhineland was ordered to be demilitarized. This is the part of Germany right across the Rhine, right across from France. Germany lost land to France and to Poland. They lose Alsace-Lorraine, which they had originally taken from France in 1871, but that's a whole different branch of history here. Germany lost land to Poland, and East Poland doesn't exist before the end of World War I. So to create Poland, you have to create it out of the people who took it, and that would basically be the Austrians and the Germans and the Russians previously. And East Prussia is cut off by what's called the Polish Corridor. And also there are several million Germans left behind in Czechoslovakia. And Cutler is going to have something to say about that later. Germany's army and navy are reduced, their air force is scrapped, and all colonies are taken by the League of Nations. Wilson was successful in getting the League of Nations added to the Versailles Treaty, a provision he believed would prevent future wars. But the U.S. Senate did not ratify the Versailles Treaty because, one, it might involve the U.S. in future wars, two, the Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, resented that he took no Republicans to Paris to negotiate, and three, that Wilson was unwilling to accept any reservations that would require Senate approval for future League-ordered military actions. Remember this idea of the Lodge reservations. Lodge said, the Senate Republicans would sign this thing. Remember, the Senate has to ratify all treaties, but Wilson is unbending. The Senate, let's see, there's also a group in the Senate called the Irreconcilables that wouldn't even accept the proposed Lodge reservations. And just fast forwarding, another treaty that is not ratified by the Senate, and that's the one signed by Jimmy Carter, SALT II agreement, and that happens right around the time here that Russia is invading Afghanistan. All right, summarize the impact of question 5 of American participation in World War I on the national economy, civil liberties, and public attitudes. Well, let's see. National economy, you have the War Industries Board organized the U.S. economy, for example, factories and train schedules to produce war goods. You have the introduction of rationing to limit consumption of goods needed for the war effort. You have women entering the workforce to replace men who went off to fight. You have the sale of Liberty/war bonds to help finance the war. Civil liberties. During World War I, you have the Sedition and Espionage Acts, which are passed to punish criticism of the war and interference with military recruiting. One target was the Socialist Party, whose presidential candidate, Eugene Debs, was arrested, tried, and convicted. And he is sent to a federal penitentiary during the war. Debs said the war was basically a plot of the capitalist bourgeoisie against the working man, and there was no reason that a German, a French, a Russian, and an American should be shooting each other in the trenches. That this was foolishness. Public attitudes. George Creel was in charge of the Committee of Public Information, the CPI, which issued war propaganda to incite public enthusiasm for the war. War bonds were pushed by national speaking tours by various celebrities. Question 6, why did President Wilson finally decide that the United States needed to enter World War I? And another question is explain why Americans were neutral at the beginning of World War I and why they abandoned that policy. Keep in mind here, World War I begins with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, Bosnia in 1914, but we don't join the war until 1917. Well, reasons for entering the war. Germany is sinking U.S. ships using their submarines, and Germany goes for broke in 1917 when they feel they've got a shot at winning on land before we can get across the Atlantic. And the Germans, of course, guessed wrong. But that first blank, submarines, the official reason why we're entering the war. Germans are also interfering with U.S. freedom of the seas, and the Germans are killing unarmed and innocent civilians. The U.S. had shown restraint in 1915 after the sinking of the British passenger ship Lusitania, on which 128 Americans drowned. Remember Wilson, even though the Americans at that time were ready to go to war, Wilson said there is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight, and he kept us out of war for another 2 years. And in 1916, Americans gratefully re-elect him on a platform of he kept us out of war. Also, Germany had brutally invaded and provoked war with neutral Belgium and democratic France, and at the time, democratic Russia. Between the time the Tsar abdicates and the time the communists take over in 1917, there is a democratic provisional government run by a guy named Alexander Kerensky. So Americans can plausibly argue that we are on the side of democracy all around. Also, had a thought, but it just kind of came and went. Maybe I'll come back to it. Okay, the real other reasons. Okay, if you're a cynic, if you are reading sort of economic motivations in this war, Germany was interfering with profits that U.S. industry was making, selling to the Allied side. Our trade skyrocketed, selling stuff, goods to the French and to the Brits, and it basically vanished, selling to the Central Powers, which would be Germany and Austria. The U.S. never was truly neutral in thought as well as deed, as Wilson had asked. The U.S. supported nations with a common language, a common political system, and with a common history. I remember what my thought was a minute ago. I just sort of did a blank out here. Referring to Belgium, the United States had been given permission after the defeat and conquest of Belgium by the Germans to feed the Belgian people. We are, very sympathetic to what has happened in Belgium, and it is future President Hoover, which is going to be in charge of a Belgian relief effort. So Americans are very sympathetic to the suffering, especially of children, of women, of families in this poor little neutral country that got steamrolled by the Kaiser's armies. All right, here, we're going to jump over to question 7, and this is the last question for Unit 11, which is on imperialism and World War I. Compare and contrast the foreign policies of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Both presidents were progressives who believed in intervention to free foreign peoples of oppression. They believed in a strong presidency and sought a position of primacy in world affairs. Well, Teddy Roosevelt, I'm going to sort of bullet point this one here. You can look in your notes in your book, review book, about details on these things. But Roosevelt and his Mr. Big Stick diplomacy, build up our military and kind of show the flag. The Great White Fleet, the Roosevelt Corollary, which we just went over, and we're sort of the repo man in Dominican Republic. The Europeans are threatening to invade to get their money, and we invade first to collect the money from the Dominicans to give to them. We're sort of the policemen here. The I-Pansfot Treaty and the Hay-Buno-Varia Treaty, referring to Panama. The Hay-Buno-Varia Treaty basically is an agreement that we will build this canal on an open basis for everyone, and we had this earlier deal with the Brits to do that. But the Panama Canal follows a U.S.-supported insurrection of the Panamanians against their Colombian overlords. The president, Teddy Roosevelt, will get the Nobel Prize for working out a peace treaty called the Treaty of Portsmouth, and this is a war between the Russians and the Japanese. The Platt Amendment is an amendment to the Cuban Constitution saying that we can intervene, and we do intervene in ensuing years, at least before Mr. Castro takes over. And the gentleman's agreement here is basically we bully the Japanese. Stop sending us immigrants if you want to see any sort of fairness for your Japanese kids in Californian schools. Woodrow Wilson, again, sort of a bullet point list of things to consider here. For his foreign policy, he kept us out of war in 1916. You've got the Zimmerman telegram. You've got unrestricted submarine warfare. You've got this idea of a war to end all wars. You've got an idea of peace without victory. You've got this, another slogan is to make the world safe for democracy. You have a description of Wilson as pursuing missionary diplomacy, this very idealistic, moralistic, kind of self-righteous. He's going to teach, the Mexicans to elect good men, and he's going to defend freedom around the world. Very 180-degree opposite of President Washington's farewell advice to stay out of other people's backyards and their business, no entangling alliances. You got the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, which is the official name of the American Army, the Doughboys, under General Blackjack Pershing. You've got the 14 points, which is the peace treaty, which Wilson is offering here. It's going to be pretty much thrown out the window with the exception of the League of Nations. But the Germans will surrender to a certain extent, thinking that they're going to get a fair shake from the Americans, who are a major party at the end of the war. And one of the great ironies of this war is the Germans surrender, and there is no fighting that takes place in the war in Germany. So the Germans are going to feel at the end of, when everything's said and done, that they've been kind of sold out by someone. And the accusation is going to be German business, the weak government that takes over Germany after the Kaiser flees, and of course the Jews. The armistice of 1918, and then the Versailles Treaty, and then the League of Nations. You can talk here about the opposition to the League of Nations by Henry Cabot Lodge and his reservations, which Wilson fails to include. You can talk about Belleau Woods and Chateau Thierry and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Some of these battles that the Americans are in, arguably, were sort of at the right time, right place at the right time, helping to turn the tide here, bolstering the morale of the Allies and discouraging the Central Power armies, namely the Germans. Again, missionary diplomacy, Pershing being sent to Mexico after Pancho Villa's attack on New Columbus, New Mexico. You could talk about the Tampico incident, and that's where American Marines land to punish the Mexicans. And the Espionage and Sedition Acts during the war, which is a violation of civil First Amendment rights. And the AP does this, they're now doing this synthesis where they're asking you to compare things to other events in American history. So the Sedition Acts, World War I, could be compared to John Adams' Sedition Acts during that period where the French are preying on our ships there, the quasi-naval war during his short term. You could talk perhaps about the Smith Act, which was passed in 1940, but is really used against the communists during the Red Scare of the 1950s. You could talk about the suspension of habeas corpus under Lincoln. These are all violations of civil rights during wartime or times of very diplomatic tension. You talk about the Red Scare from 1919 to 1920. You could talk about the Russian Revolution and the U.S. sending soldiers to fight the Bolsheviks in Russia, which is something which we do. And you could talk about the Underwood Tariff Reform in 1913, which is a reduction on the tax on imports. This is meant to help the American consumer not have to pay so much money at the expense of making factory owners wealthy. And just an aside here, nothing really to do with foreign affairs, but the tariff is going to go down, but what's going to help make up the money here is going to be the beginning of an income tax. And that amendment will also be passed during the Wilson years here. So there you have it. That's some questions, past questions from our unit 11 here on imperialism and on World War I. So keep studying, stay calm, and carry on.